He was on vacation or something. Baltimore City Council Ways and Means Committee, we're here today for two bills. I'm Eric Costello, Councilman from the 11th District, Chair of the committee, joined to my right by Council Vice President Sharon Green Middleton, 6th District, member of the committee, Councilman John Bullock, 9th District. To my left, Councilman Mark Conway, 4th District, Councilwoman Odette Ramos, 14th District, Councilman Chris Burnett, 8th District, member of the committee, and Vice Chair, Councilman Robert Stokes, 12th District. We're going to start off with Council Bill 21-0178, tax credits, historic properties, definition of historic property. This is a reconvening. I'm going to turn it over to Councilman Bullock, sponsor of the bill, for brief introductory remarks.
All right, and thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, committee. It's very fitting that almost a year to the day we revisit this bill that we voted on an amendment for last year. As we've talked about in the past, the purpose of the bill was to extend the definition, or expand the definition of historic to make the tax credit available to more Baltimore City residents. We know that there were some initial concerns with the bill, and so to alleviate those concerns in terms of state legislation, the bill was amended from 50 years to replace it with a property located in the boundaries of a certified historic area or heritage area, excuse me. And then the other piece that I think is worth mentioning in terms of the fiscal impact, I know in front of the same committee, we also extended the CHAP tax credit for an additional year. So again, the impact will be limited at this point, but I do believe it'll be something that'll be favorable for the residents of Baltimore to take advantage of this. One other point to note, again, in our previous conversations, there's been a lot of discussion around equity and equitable usage of tax credits, and we believe by expanding this definition, it will allow more Baltimore City residents to take advantage of this. So again, thank you for the time, and thank you for taking a vote on this today.
Thank you. We're going to jump into agency reports. Board of Estimates, this will be submitted to the BOE if and when after approval. The Commission for Historic and Architectural Preservation, I know that they had comments. The amendment that my colleague referenced satisfied their comments, if I'm not mistaken. Is there anything else from CHAP?
Good morning, Chairman Costello. This is Sophia from Mayor's Office of Government Relations. CHAP approves the bill with amendment.
Thank you.
And it looks like Stacey Montgomery is also online.
Yeah,
Got
online.
it. Okay. Department of Planning favorable and supports the CHAP amendment. Has anything changed there?
Exactly, yes. Approves
So
with
nothing-
amendment.
Nothing's changed, okay. And Department of Housing and Community Development defers to Finance. Has anything changed there?
We stand by our bill report, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. And Department of Law, unfavorable?
Yes, this amendment fixes the issue we had with the bill, so now we could approve it for form and legal sufficiency.
Outstanding, thank you. And Department of Finance opposes?
Yeah, so just want to explain our original response and what we think about the amendment. So originally, when the bill was to open this up to any property over 50 years or more, it was a pretty big expansion, and we noted in our report our opposition to the cost. This amendment makes it more limited. You know, heritage area is still a pretty significant expansion of the program, so we do have concerns about that. When we came to the council earlier about the CHAP credit extension, our thinking was that we would eventually make this credit citywide. We didn't think there was a good reason to just limit it to historic districts because of the way the maps are drawn. You do exclude a lot of areas. But I do want to clarify that if we do that, we've got to take a crack at the cost. This is a 100% tax credit, which means that there are probably areas that would get the development if we offered 50% or 70% or something lower. So, you know, this expansion is in line with what we were thinking, but when we come to renew the tax credit, in order to make this cost neutral, this will likely not be a 100% tax credit anymore. We're gonna have to look at where we grant the credit and if we can do it with less in some of the areas that are already doing pretty well in terms of development.
Got it, thank you. Colleagues, any questions? Is there any public testimony on this one? Anyone here from the public who wishes to testify? Okay. Colleagues, is there a motion to move the bill favorably as amended?
Motion to move the bill as amended.
Motion by Vice President Middleton. Is there a second?
What was that again?
There's a motion to move the bill favorably by VP. There's a motion to move the bill favorably as amended in the previous hearing. There's a second by Burnett. Costello is a yes. Burnett?
Yes.
Dorsey is an excused absence. One second. Okay, McCray is going to be here momentarily, so we may reopen the vote to record her. She's absent for now. Middleton?
Yes.
Schleifer is absent. Stokes?
Yes.
This bill passes with 4 yeses, 2 absences, and 1 excused absence. Moves to second reader at the next meeting of the City Council. All right. Next up, legislative oversight, LO 21-0003, budget briefing with BBMR. Bob, we're going to turn it over to you and Laura.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us here today to talk with you about the second quarter, our second quarter projections, as well as some key revenue updates, both for fiscal 23 and then also as in terms of the revenue assumptions in the fiscal 24 preliminary budget. My name is Laura Larson. I'm the city's budget director. I'm going to walk through the highlights and expenditure portion of our second quarter projections, and then I'll turn it over to Pedro Aponte, assistant budget director in BBMR, who will walk through revenue both on the for fiscal 23 as of the second quarter, and then some key revenue highlights in the fiscal 24 budget. So as we talk about second quarter, so again, second quarter would represent the expenditures and revenue that we received from July 1st of 2022 through December 31st of 2022, so the first half of this fiscal year. And so based off of those numbers, in the city's general fund, we're projecting about a $23 million surplus. That's driven by primarily what we're seeing on the revenue side. We're seeing about a $63 million surplus next year, and a portion of that is being offset by a projected deficit on the expenditure side. When we compare these numbers to what we were projecting in the first quarter, the overall outlook has improved by about $55 million. I will say that is primarily driven by what we're seeing, again, on the revenue side. And Pedro will walk through this in more detail, but essentially we're in fiscal 23, we saw the lingering benefit of the strong real estate market from transfer and recordation taxes from last summer's real estate market. We're seeing strong investment earnings that are driven by the higher interest rates, and then continued strength in the city's income taxes. In terms of what's happening on that expenditure side, we continue to see deficits pertaining to public safety overtime in the police and fire departments. And then we are continuing to see sort of the last round of the city's COVID response costs that are being reimbursed through FEMA. Again, those costs have been unbudgeted since the start of the pandemic. Do just want to note, as we're walking through these numbers, this is based off of information that we had through December 31st of this year. So we are in the process of completing our third quarter projections. So we may see some of these assumptions and numbers change as they do every fiscal year as we get more information as we move throughout the year. So just when we put that $23 million surplus in the context of the overall general fund budget for fiscal 23, again on the revenue side, we're seeing revenues come in about 3% higher than what we had assumed in the budget, and our expenditure numbers are coming in about just under 2% over budget. And then this year's budget included $90.5 million for pay-as-you-go capital funding that will be transferred to the capital projects fund. So just looking at the expenditure numbers in a little bit more detail, one of the things that we look at is in terms of how our expenditures are playing out through each of the quarters in terms of how we're trending. In the first quarter, we saw agencies spend down about 26% of the budget throughout the general fund. The second quarter spending was about 24% of the budget. So actually that's trending really nicely as we move through the fiscal year. We, as of December 1st, we had spent down about half the budget. One of the things to note is that that's looking at the city's general fund in aggregate. We do see a lot of seasonality in spending based off of different types of city agencies and their operations. For example, in the Rec and Parks Department, we see spending really uptick during the summer months when the pools are open. They have a lot of seasonal staffing. On the other hand, transportation, we may see costs go way up during the winter in terms of their costs associated with snow and ice removal. The other thing to note here is this is just reflecting straight spending. It's not reflecting any funds for contracts that are getting encumbered or committed throughout the fiscal year. So this is really just looking at how we're spending down money. When we talk about some of the deficits that we are projecting in this year's budget, at the first quarter we had shared the deficit in the fire department. We're projecting about a $17.5 million deficit for the fire department. This projection is consistent with what we had shared at the first quarter. We're continuing to see high overtime numbers that are driven by their higher vacancy rate. Because the fire department has a daily minimum staffing, if they have a higher number of vacant positions, they have to fill those shifts back by callback overtime. And so where we are in terms of their vacancy count is that any sort of savings we would be realizing from vacant positions has now been surpassed by the cost of filling those shifts with overtime. As of May 1st, so yesterday, the fire department had 213 vacant positions. That was up 21% since the start of fiscal 23. On the police department side, we're seeing about a $16 million deficit. Again, within police, this is driven by overtime costs and then different incentive pays that are associated with their contract. Consistent with the fire department, it's the same story. There's a high number of vacancies in the police department, and in order to fill their daily minimum staffing levels, they're relying on overtime shifts in order to meet their staffing model. Just like fire, police is seeing their vacancies really go up throughout this fiscal year. As of yesterday, they had 158 vacant positions, and that's up about 30% since the start of this fiscal year. Hang on, I just want to, I want to correct the stats on a couple of those. The police, and I'll reflect these in an updated version of slides. The police vacancy count this month is 651 positions. That's a 20% vacancy rate overall. And the fire department vacancy number is 198. That's a 12% vacancy rate in that department. So I apologize for that mistake, and we'll update these slides. The final expenditure item that I want to bring your attention to is our COVID response costs in the health department. Since the start of the pandemic, the city has been tracking our citywide costs associated with our response and tracking those in a central location within the health department. Through May 11th, so for the next 9 days, we'll continue to be reimbursed at 90% for these costs. Right now, we're continuing to receive reimbursement for our hotel sheltering costs for individuals experiencing homelessness. We received FEMA reimbursement for our vaccine rollout efforts, and we're continuing to receive funding for some of our eligible health department expenditures. Again, these costs have been unbudgeted since the start of the pandemic, and fiscal 23 is the last year that we'll see this because we're currently working with agencies to make sure that we're transitioning those costs of those services that will continue to different funding sources before the May 11th deadline. And finally, on the expenditure side, just one thing I want to acknowledge as we look at these numbers. Fiscal 23 is the first year where we're fully utilizing Workday in terms of running our accounting entries, payroll, purchasing. And so this is also our first year of using the system to do our budget to actual analysis. One thing that's important to keep in mind when it comes to Workday budget is actually in the third phase of that project. So we've not transitioned the budget into Workday. That will be done as when over the summer months in preparation for the fiscal 25 budget build. So we are sort of dealing with the disconnect between the budget system and Workday. And that is causing some data interpretation issues as we look to understand how different expenses are being charged in Workday and make sense of that information. I will say this is normal for a system conversion, but as we move into the end of the fiscal year, we're really working closely with agencies to identify areas where it looks like things have been potentially mischarged or in the wrong place as we try to refine, make sure that the actuals are in line with the budget as we go into year end. So some of the areas that we're closely working on is making sure that positions are being charged in the way that they were funded in the fiscal 23 budget. We're working on making sure that grants are being properly expensed and that grant expenditures are showing up in the right place, and that we're accurately forecasting different purchasing activity in terms of how we're looking at how commitments and encumbrances impact the city's budget. As I mentioned, budget will be part of the third phase of this implementation, and so our work on that is really going to pick up after we get done with the fiscal 24 budget deliverables. So with that, I'll turn it over to Pedro, and he will walk
Laura,
us.
can we, real quick, Pedro, we're going to go into recess for a quick minute.
Okay.
Colleagues, is there a motion to reconsider Council Bill 21-0178, tax credits, historic properties, definition of a historic property? Motion by Middleton. Is there a second? Second by Burnett. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. Is there a motion to move the bill favorably as amended?
Move favorable as amended.
Motion by Middleton, second by Burnett. Costello is a yes. Burnett?
Yes.
Dorsey's an excused absence. McCray?
Yes.
Middleton?
Yes.
Schleifer is absent. Stokes?
Yes.
This bill passes with 5 yeas, 1 absence, and 1 excused absence, and moves to second reader at the next meeting of the City Council. We will now reconvene LO 21-0003. Pedro?
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Pedro Aponte, Assistant Budget Director for BBMR. I'm joined by our wonderful analyst, Kat Stagger, who has helped the unit to put together this presentation, the quarterly projection, and the fiscal 2024 budget. The first item I want to brief you on is highlight for the second quarter projection. Again, this is with data as of December 2022. Some of the items in the revenue didn't have full information as of that date. One of these items is income tax, and I'll give you more details later. The two positive highlights as of December are transfer tax and recordation tax and investment earnings. As we have mentioned throughout the budget presentations for the last couple of weeks, transfer recordation tax has been the highlight of both fiscal 2023 and 2024. For 2023, we are anticipating, well, we'll give it more details later. We're anticipating a $29.4 million surplus in recordation transfer tax, and the other important item to highlight here is investment earnings. As you know, interest rate have been increasing since last year, and that has an impact in our finances. On the negative side, we have to mention an issue, operational issue that we found early in the fiscal year when the data we were using for the budget and for projections included 1,300 properties duplicates in that data set, which overstated the budget by about $590 million in assessment. And the other item for negative that we need to highlight is the collection rate for speed and red light violations. One thing that we want to clarify that this 44% that we are say in the presentation, snapshot of what's happening for violations issued in that year and the amount of money that we are receiving in that year. We have a different collection rate that is accounting for citations issues from the beginning of the deployment of this program. Okay, this slide just show a little detail of where the components for these surpluses and deficits are coming from. Local taxes represents $30 million of the surplus, and then use of money and property, which is directly related to investment earnings, is $22 million. Some of the deficits, as we mentioned, coming from fine and forfeit, which is specifically related to speed cameras. More into details of what the local taxes are, again, we have to highlight the negative impact of these duplicates in the real property tax data. That represents about $10 million in deficit compared to the budget. But that deficit is compensated by, or offset by income tax, which is $11.4 million higher than the budget, and recordation and transfer tax combined $29 million. So this is just to illustrate the highlights. The surpluses and deficits, where they're coming from by groups. Again, the far left, we have recordation, explained the $29 million. The far right, we have real property tax with the $10 million deficit. Some of the difference between second quarter, we are presenting to you right now, and first quarter is, the first one is $9.8 million for hardware user revenue. Reason why we have this surplus in the second quarter, and we didn't anticipate that in the first quarter, is the timing for the data we receive from the state. They provide monthly reports to us that detail the components of hardware user revenue. At the time we have first quarter projection, we did not have full information, only 1 month. But the time we did second quarter projection, we have information as of September, and that gave us enough resources to illustrate this surplus. The second one is investment earnings. We had already in first quarter anticipated a large surplus, but in the second quarter, the amount of cash that we have available for investment and the interest rate generated this additional surplus. Recordation and transfer tax, I think I'm going to explain a little bit more in detail what happened with the recordation and transfer tax, but again, it's an operational issue that worked in our favor, where a number of transactions were, there was a backlog in the number of transactions that we processed, carried from fiscal 2022, and as these transactions were processed, we realized additional revenue. On the negative side, again, traffic cameras, we see a decline in the number of citations issued, but also the collection rate is playing an important component explaining this deficit. Income tax compared to fiscal 2000 to the first quarter of 2021, it was $5.1 million lower. The reason is, at the time we put first quarter projection for income tax, we had no information from the state. The first important data that comes from the state in reference to income tax comes in November. So that's what this projection reflects, this deficit compared to first quarter. And lastly, property taxes, again, that's the issue that I mentioned in terms of the number of duplicates that were found in the data set that we use for budget and projections. I'm not sure if you want to ask questions.
No, you're gonna go to.
So, giving details about the components of the surpluses and deficit, again, it's going to sound redundant, but we have to really talk about these revenue sources. In investment earnings, we are anticipating, at the time we were doing the projection, the average return on investment was 2.5%, roughly 2.5%, and the average daily cash was $2.3 billion. that money comes from all the payments that we receive, taxes and any, especially property taxes. By the time we did this projection, we have the first payment for most of the bills issued in July 1st. So just to have some reference, when we were putting the budget together, we knew the federal government increasing interest rate, but we were averaging in 2022 roughly 0.21% return. And when we started fiscal 2023, we were anticipating 1.67%. When we talk about fiscal 2024, we will explain where we are looking at in terms of returns for this particular revenue source. Again, we are looking at roughly $23 million surplus only from this revenue item. Income tax, as I mentioned before, one of the items that give us information of how good or bad the city is going happens in November. The city received 4 quarterly distributions through the year, and these quarterly distributions represent roughly 85% of the total income tax revenue. Other components of the income tax are interest and penalties, reconciliation from prior payments, and all this is related of how the state receive cash. I think it's important to mention that there is a lag in terms of those reconciliations that the state has to provide in terms of city residents paying their taxes and how the money is distributed. The state has an allocation formula where they proceed these payments through the year, but it doesn't have, it is based on the most recent ended tax year. That means that all the monies that we are receiving fiscal 2023 is using calendar year 2021 tax returns, and any modification that occurred through the fiscal year. At the time we did this projection, we were looking at 10.8% distribution for the November distribution compared to the budget. However, we have noticed that the composition in terms of proceeds or what represents the city in terms of the state has been declining historically. It doesn't mean that we are not growing, it's just that we are growing at a slower pace than the state.
Excuse me real quick, I just want to recognize Council President Mosby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so in terms of just talking about what the deficits for the first quarter projection are, it's important to notice that, as you know, moving violations are subject to behavior of the drivers. So we have, next chart's gonna show that we have historical information showing how the behavior changed, so the number of citations per camera is consistently declining. We are not anticipating any increase in the number of cameras. What we are anticipating is relocation of these cameras. But as this chart explained here, historically we are looking at 71% collection rate for speed and 72% collection rate for red light. Now that's the historical collection rate. That means number of citations issued from the first day of this program until now. But there is another collection rate that we assess in order to make sure how revenues are coming for this fiscal year, and that collection rate is the number of citations that have been issued in this 12-month, in this case 6-month period, how much cash we have received in this 6-month period. And that is where we look at 44% collection rate. I don't think this is an alarming rate, because what's going to happen as we move forward, we anticipate that collection rate to grow as people start paying, you know, the NBA flags, registration, and that kind of stuff. But the collection rate, the snapshot collection rate we are talking about as of now is lower than what we have experienced in prior years. And that's why we are anticipating this deficit of $3.2 million combined for red light and red light and speed cameras. So just to give some flavor of what exactly violations look like in terms of behavior, this chart has a 60 months of historical average citations issue for those cameras had been longer than at least 60, active for 60 period. You can clearly say that the deployment of these cameras, the number of citations increased, but gradually they start decreasing. And that's it's normal. As people become aware of where these cameras are, they slow down. Good example, site 83. I think the last item for discussion in terms of fiscal 2023 second quarter projections, the high performance tax credit. And what is shown here is the addition of 10 projects that received this credit in fiscal 2023 that we did not anticipate or we didn't incorporate into the budget. Those 10 projects had a roughly $5 million additional cost to this program. These additional projects came as a result of this City Council Bill 210167 that reduced the number of units required in order to be eligible for this tax credit. Now we're going to jump to, I missed property taxes, and again, this is an issue that.
Quick question. Sorry, quick question.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chair?
Sure.
That bill reduced it from 50 units to what?
I think the number is 220. I can get back to you.
From 50 to 20?
Yeah,
All
and
right.
the threshold is still $60,000, but it reduced the number of properties that will receive the credit.
Got you. And could you, they're confirming, and could you tell us, I guess, the amount of projects that, when we see the slide, can you tell us the amount of increase in projects?
For the high performance?
That pulled in?
Yeah, so there are two programs for the high performance. One is the targeted, that is basically closed. No new applications are there. I think we are talking about 20 particular projects that are currently receiving that, and then the citywide. This is where the legislation expanded the program. And we went from 18 projects in 2022, now we have 28 projects.
28?
Yes.
So it increased 10?
10, by 10, yes. And that doesn't mean that we won't grant more credits.
Yes. So the issue there was, in your projection, you didn't anticipate the change from 50 units to 20 units?
What we did, yes, that nutshell, yes. What happened is that the expansion of the program, we didn't know how many projects with a reducing number of units were going to be applying. We didn't have that information, pipeline projects applying for this. So we estimated our numbers based on historical information, how many participants had been applying for this credit historically, and the average value subject to the credit, assessment subject to the credit in historical, from prior years. This wasn't accounted. This new project were not accounted.
I guess the council, as we continue to go down this path of doing the evaluation of tax credits, I mean, we got to take that up serious. I know that inclusionary housing is on the agenda, particularly as it relates to fitting in high performance, but I guess this is of some concern, the reduction from 50 to 20. My assumption is finance probably discouraged the council on that at the time. I don't have the agency reports. Can you remember the advice from finance at the time?
Yeah, we definitely, I know, it's not the right word, we opposed to the legislation.
I'm pretty sure, okay, just making sure. Thank you.
So real quick, after you do your first presentation, we're gonna take questions from council members, and then before you go into your physical 2024 projections.
Back statements for every single bill.
So if you finish that, are you finished?
23.
Okay, so we're gonna get some questions on your first presentation.
It's up to you.
Okay, so Councilwoman Ramos?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a few questions, but I guess we'll do the two-question rule.
Yes.
The May 11th deadline for FEMA reimbursement, is that like we're not receiving any more money after May 11th, or we can put money in as for reimbursement until that date, and then we will get paid after that at some point?
So we can seek reimbursement for all the costs we receive up to May 11th.
Okay.
And then there is a window of time after May 11th where we can complete all of our reporting requirements for that last round of expenditures in order to get reimbursed in the future. But any like expenditures starting on May 12th, we can't seek reimbursement for those.
Right, but we're still continuing some of those services with the ARPA money until that's obviously a question for MOHS, but some of those services are still going to be continued. We're just not going to get reimbursed for it.
That's exactly right. So it's primarily the Mayor's Office of Homeless Services and the Health Department that have programs that will be continuing after May 11th. And so those agencies are working on transitioning the costs that they're still incurring from those services to different funding sources. So like in the case of MOHS, they are working to identify the best funding source to move those sheltering costs to as the FEMA money dries up.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Thanks for that clarity. And then my other question is on this duplicate records of the property tax. Is that this is the first year that we're seeing this problem? What happened, and how did we? That's a lot of records, and that's a lot of money.
So after we discovered, we talked to the IT department and all agencies that have involvement with this. What happened is there were several properties that were split, and they include those properties into the file, but they did not adjust other assessments or units that were in the original file. That was discovered early in the fiscal year, and by the time we put those numbers together, the bills were already sent. So when we got the bills is when we saw the discrepancy, and when we went through the files, when we started looking at those numbers that didn't make sense in terms of the bill amount and what we were anticipating in terms of revenue.
So, but I don't understand. So, I mean, I understand what you're saying. I just don't understand how this happened. I mean, is there
It was a mainframe issue, meaning that
for just this year, or has it been an issue in the past and we've got to make up for the deficits?
No. It happened for this year.
Just this year?
Yes, just this year.
That there were these repeats?
Yes.
And you sent out duplicate bills?
No. This is about projections. Nobody received a duplicate bill.
Okay.
The file that we use for projections is not the file that is used for bills.
Okay.
So that was an internal process where we get data from BCIT, and that file includes duplicates. As far as I know, nobody received a duplicate.
Yeah,
bills.
I haven't heard, so.
Okay, so no, it's not.
Just checking.
No, it was internal, and we use that information to do projections.
Right, okay.
The file was wrong.
Okay, so then you just had to adjust, it's basically showing that we had thought that we would get another 580 million, and we're not going to get that.
The 580 million in assessment, so it's reduced by $11 million in
Right, so
property taxes.
that is the only reason for the reduction in the property tax projection?
That's correct.
That is the only reason? It's not tax credits, it's not,
Tax rate is separate.
it's
Remember
not
that-
collection rates because we're taking people out of town? Like, I'm just trying to understand exactly what this is.
No, when we do projections, we incorporate all these factors that you are, describing right now. We have to have a collection rate, and that collection rate is based on prior years' collections, right? So we said how much money we bill, how much money we collected. Is this consistent? What other factors could change that collection rate? We have to take into account any decision that is made in terms of tax sale. So we incorporate that. This is not that issue. Is only it was a consequence of the duplicate. All other components
Okay, so all the other things I just talked about, you generally took into consideration in your
yes.
projections because we've been doing it for a while and
Yes,
you knew,
yes.
okay.
And we have, one is collection rate. We also have a factor for appeals, a factor for new constructions. We also incorporate how much money we're gonna get for additional tax credit that are, coming to the tax roll. We take into account the tax sale exemption program. So all this is built into the projection. Now, when we have 1,300 properties that overstate that change the bottom line.
Okay,
But
I just
all
wanted to
other
be clear
components
that,
are included there.
that the only reason we're seeing this deficit is because of the error
Yeah.
and not anything
Correct.
else. Okay, okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Council President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just real quick, does finance have like GIS software to do graphical mapping? Like, is there a way for you to plot out all the addresses of high-performance tax credits over the past couple of years on a map for us?
We don't. We rely on BCIT. They have a
Could you work on that for me? Could you take the addresses that are tied into the
The
tax credits
high
that we're talking about?
performance.
Yep,
Sure.
specific to high performance. And if you could just do it over the past, like, maybe 5 years, with each year being a different color? Thank you so much.
Councilman Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you, well, this is more of a request to the agency. Can we get a breakdown of vacancies by, in police and fire by position?
Is that a request?
Yeah,
Okay.
committee request.
So you want the vacancy, just the vacancy count for police and fire in, as of,
Which positions are open?
in terms of the, yeah, so you want to see like the number of filled positions versus the number of vacant positions?
I'm only interested in vacancies.
Okay,
And what the vacancies are. So if they're sergeant.
Oh, by
if they're EMS,
classification.
Yeah, by classification.
okay, yep, we can provide that.
And that's already part of our larger request that we've been working on together.
And we provided, yep, we,
Yeah, I
yep.
think that there was some follow-up from Nathan, so, regarding, the amount of time the position's been vacant by each agency.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that fits right into Council,
Yep.
Burnett's question. So
Okay.
when you send it to us, if you could just copy him on it.
Okay, we can do that.
And for fire in particular, I mean, this is a question I've asked a number of times, and I know that no one's here from fire, but has there been reconsideration of opening the hiring list for the fire department on a rolling basis, like the police department is, where they have rolling hiring, EMS has rolling hiring, but for fire positions, it's open every 4 to 5 years or so, which I don't quite fully understand, particularly if there are this many vacancies in the agency, why they would maintain a wait list when there's obviously interest in the department.
Yeah. So I believe the list for the fire department stays active for 2 years. And so in fiscal '24, they'll go through the process of building a new list and start to hire off that new list. And fire will be speaking about this at their budget hearing, but we can also get more information to you before that. I know from talking to them, there was a pause in their recruitment during COVID that caused them to get sort of behind, because pre-COVID, they were keeping pace with their list, with their attrition. So what happened was they took a pause during COVID for their recruitment, and then they got behind. And so part of the problem now is that based off of the pace that they can offer academies and the number of people that they can put through their classes, that's enough for them to keep up with attrition. They're having, so we're working with them to identify some creative solutions that we figure out how do we not only get ahead of attrition, but how do we also work on identifying this backlog of vacancies as well, so that we can get back to a more normal vacancy rate that makes it easier to manage and where we're not so heavily reliant on overtime.
Yeah, it was surprising to see, given the level of interest we know that there is in the department. And then the last, if you have
Real quick, Council, do you want just to break down the fire and police department, or you want all agencies?
just fire and police.
Okay.
Yep. Just a quick question on investment earnings. What happens with when there are earnings over what your projections are? Are those earnings reinvested into the market? Are they withdrawn out of the fund and into the general fund? Like, just sort of what happens?
So it's a revenue item for the general fund. So once we get those proceeds, that become part of the available resources to fund operations.
Okay.
So at the end of the fiscal year, it's treated as a regular revenue source.
Yeah.
So if we have a surplus, those monies will be potentially going to fund balance. If not, it's treated as a regular revenue line item, like any other one.
And I'll wait. I have more questions, but I'm sure others do.
Council Vice President Middleton.
Thank you. On the 2 pages for the moving violations, can we get a breakdown on, I guess, looking at that, you have a, section of your collections and then a section of a decline in volume.
Mm-hmm.
And we have areas in the city, like 83 that's fairly new that is collecting a lot of money. And I know Delegate Sandy Rosenberg had put in a state bill where communities aligned to that one major thoroughfare have that money go and help in those various communities. So I think it's important if we kind of get a breakdown of, how the revenue that's coming in those areas, 83, I mean, these are just examples, Liberty Heights, Charles Street, York Road, I could go on throughout the city, but I think it's important if we see the decline, because we are in these communities and know how these streets are, it would help if we need to move those cameras somewhere else on that street to slow down the traffic or, things like that. So I think it's important if we get the breakdown of, these, particularly the major thoroughfares of where, you have these cameras.
So, Councilwoman, just to understand precisely what you want, just the location of the camera and how many citations this camera issue?
And I'd like to know the actual revenue that's being received.
The actual revenue, okay.
So, all of that. I just think it's helpful for us to kind of see and, help continue the revenue going and help to keep safety within the city.
Sure, and you want for both, red light and speed?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And just a point of clarification, I-83 is not bringing a lot of money, so you know.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions from anybody on this end? Councilwoman Ramos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a question about the highway user revenues. It says in here that you're projecting a 9 million surplus.
From first quarter.
From first quarter.
Compared
Right,
to
but my question was whether or not that's because of the extra we're anticipating because of the bill that passed in the General Assembly, or if there's something else that you're projecting.
That is entirely to the new allocation that was passed
Yeah.
last year.
Yeah.
And again, when we do quick first quarter projection, we didn't have any information from the state on how receipts were coming for fiscal 2023. So we kept that number as budget. Now, with the new data that we get, we actually saw all 5 components of the distribution, and we identified certain of those components going up and some other going down. But because the allocation for the city has increased, that's what's reflected in
Okay,
this.
so it's not necessarily that you had already projected the change, I guess because it passed at the end of last session, so you didn't anticipate that in your projections, and so that's why it's a.
We anticipate, we look at the components at the time we did the projection, the fiscal 2023 budget. And I think it's going to clarify a little bit more when we go to the next slide, because it's the timing. When we do projections for the budget, we end those projections basically in January. So whatever happens in January to the end of the fiscal year, we cannot account that. So we do our best analysis or best approach based on our models with the data we have at that time, incorporated change on the allocation, for example, for the city at the time. But we did our due diligence and incorporate those adjustments. The numbers are coming different now.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure it was the same number that we were all hoping for from the state. And then I wonder if I can ask a friendly amendment to the council president's request regarding the high performance tax credit maps to also include brownfields and the brownfields as well, credit.
You said brownfield, and the second one is?
Just brownfields.
Just the brownfield, and same thing, 5 years.
I think we have it somewhere, but
All that information is in the BBMAR tax credit report. There's maps. They only go through, I think, either 2021 or 2020, so we can get you the more current. But if you want to look at it immediately, there are maps in our tax credit report that show the locations of where those properties are. We can pull the specific addresses.
those are cumulative. I think what the council president was asking is
Just
like a
the-
different color by year.
Just the ones approved in the last.
Couple years.
No, it was the different colors by year, is that correct? You're right. Yeah,
Okay.
for the last 5 years. So to add the brownfields to that as well, or produce a separate map. So we just wanted to see kind of where the projects are being approved over time. Am I correct? And then adding brownfields to that. That would be great. I think that's all I have. Thanks.
Okay, Councilman Burnett?
Thank
And then
you.
we're going to move to the second part of the presentation.
Yeah, I just have one quick question, Mr. Chair. On the slide about the health department expenditures for housing and hotels, where are we? I know that there was a conversation last year about the acquiring hotels. Where are we with the acquisition?
Yeah, so there's ARPA funding to acquire hotels to serve as a permanent shelter for individuals experiencing homelessness. The Mayor's Office of Homeless Services is actively working with the Department of Real Estate in order to secure those properties and to identify the locations that the city would like to purchase. And so those negotiations are ongoing, and MOHS is leading that work.
I have a follow-up question to that.
Yeah, I'm good. Go ahead.
In the preliminary budget, I saw that we were only purchasing one. And it was my understanding from last budget, we were supposed to be purchasing two. What's the change?
So MOHS is continuing to work with the administration to finalize the plan of what sort of reflects the operating model that they're working towards and aligns with the available resources that we have, both for acquisition and then to operate it. And so again, the Mayor's Office of Homeless Services can, I think, speak more directly to what is currently being planned. And I know that they're sort of working with the administration to finalize those decisions.
So it could be two at some point in time, even though the preliminary budget talks about one.
That is, so one is further, again, they're continuing to identify sort of what works best in terms of what they can afford and then what kind of fits into the long-term operating model for the agency in terms of what will ultimately get acquired.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think it's extremely important that we provide non-congregate shelter and that it needs to be a priority that it's two. I get that once we acquire, then we have to operate it. I get that. And then once the ARPA fund, I understand. But we are in a pretty desperate situation here. So we need to have the two. Thanks.
Okay, now we're going to move on to the second part of the presentation. Sure.
So the second part is highlighting how the 2024 revenue was built and taking into account the main revenue accounts. So I think it's important for us to explain a little bit how the process for building the revenue budget works. And so this chart has a timeline where we start doing projections and where we end and how much data we can incorporate into the next year budget. So when we start this process, we do it in roughly when we start transitioning from the first quarter to get into the second quarter, and we are doing three things. First is the first quarter projection with data as of the end of September. Then we are doing the CLS projection, which is the main component for the budget. This is the first step of the budget. That's where we decide, or we make, we inform our revenue team and the budget director how much money will be available with the data we have at the time to continue the providing the same level of services. And we also do the first round of the 10-year projection. So that's happening in September, October. Then we go, the budget process is kicked off and the process start. We do a second round of projection for the budget in January. Is key, the key information that we get is, one, we have better information from the state in terms of income tax, how the payments are coming once we are coming to the city. Now that we have first quarter proceeds from the state. But the other important component here is assessments. In January 1st, we get the actual revision of assessment that the state provides for the following fiscal year, and at that time we review our projection, real property tax projection, and make assumptions on how that number will change in July 1st. At that time, we also start working on the second quarter projection, and we do a review of the 10-year projection as well, based on the new information that we get. At that time, we're also, the department is meeting with administration and, identifying priorities and deciding what is going to be included into the budget. And we do minor changes to the revenue projection until we get to this stage where we are right now, where we know what happened with the General Assembly, and those minor changes or any changes that happen with the General Assembly are the last step we incorporate to the budget. But it's important to inform that by January, February is when we stop doing robust projection for the revenues, because we are now giving the best assessment that we have of what the fiscal of the next year budget will look like in terms of revenue. We make minor adjustments, but no substantial changes to the projection. So, with that in mind, when we are building the budget, we are trying to accomplish at least 2% up or down variance of actual versus budget, and this chart shows our historical performance. Our goal is 2%, up and down. We have been able to achieve that in a couple years. Obviously, 2022 is not the best example. We have an extraordinary year in terms of revenue. We definitely didn't meet that goal. But for fiscal 2023, based on the information we have, we are hoping that we can achieve the 3% in the variance between actuals and budget within the 3% range. Now, going to details, the major revenue items for the fiscal 2024 budget. The first one we're gonna, first we're anticipating a $101 million change in revenues compared to the fiscal 2023 budget, and the key components are explained on the left side of this chart. We're gonna go I'm gonna detail each of them. The first one is property taxes. As you know, assessments for fiscal 2024 are reflecting Group 2 reassessment, which is our experience meet 20% increase in assessment in average. Now, that is not what all properties will experience in fiscal 2024. One thing that is important to highlight here, and that is, and the budget director has explained this in prior opportunities, assessment increase are phasing. So you have to, the 20% that we are anticipating in fiscal 2024, it's not going to be incorporated to the tax roll at once. It's going to be split in 3. But another component that's important to say, when a property is reassessed down, meaning that's going to experience a decrease in assessment, that hits immediately. And that assessment remains for the next 3 years. and that's one of the explanations that we have here why what we are anticipating in terms of revenue is not the 7.2% that is the 1/3 of of what the state provide information. We are anticipating $29 million revenue increase from fiscal 2023. These numbers also offset by roughly $3 million in the cost for the tax increment finances. As you know, assessments also are part of what the taxable value that is used for debt service, the TIF projects. So the way we treat this is that the total amount of revenues coming into the tax roll, we need to isolate the portion that goes to TIF, and that portion has increased by $3 million. So that $29 million that we're assuming for fiscal 2024 property taxes is offset by the $3 million reduction in TIF debt service. Basic assumptions remain the same. We are still anticipating a 97.5 collection rate. We are assuming a little bit higher appeal factor just to account for the increase in assessment that has been experienced in Group 2. And the other component of real property is personal property tax, and that 1.9% increase that we are assuming is based on historical information. The second item that we want to highlight here is transfer recordation tax. When we were talking about the second quarter projection, fiscal 2023, we briefly mentioned about the situation. There was a backlog in the number of transactions processed by a revenue collection unit. That it has 11 weeks at the beginning of fiscal 2023. It went down to 8, and at this time is already completed. So we are actually processing transactions within a week of when we receive them. So what even though we are anticipating a small increase, $6.8 million combined revenue, this is the result of two things. One, prices are not necessarily dropping like it happened 10 years ago when the housing bubble burst in the 2000s and late 2000s. But the number of transactions definitely is declining, and it's a normal result of how the real estate market is behaving. We have higher interest rate that is reducing the mortgage origination, plus is definitely stopping the very large number of transactions subject to recordation tax that we experienced in the last couple of years, because it's very unlikely that people will be refinancing at a higher interest rate. Normally it happens the opposite. So, but still, I think the situation for the city is positive in terms of the new base, in terms of prices for properties in the city. But definitely we are looking at declining number of transactions for the next year. For income tax, we relied on data and the analysis that the State Bureau of Revenue estimates provide. They were anticipated in early this year a 4.9 increase in the receipts for withholding and estimated payments. It's important to highlight that withholding and estimated payments represent roughly 85%, 90% of the total cash that the state receives in terms of income tax. Just as a context, a background information, the state receives money from all jurisdictions on a daily basis, from all taxpayers that withheld money and individuals who make estimated payments. The state doesn't know where that money is coming from. So they have to prepare an allocation formula based on 2 years tax returns and do allocations for those jurisdictions. So what we're looking at is based on the information that we have analyzed in from 2021 income tax report and the quarterly distribution that we received, the city is reducing the percentage that I guess, the share that is allocated to the city from the state income tax. That is not alarming because we're still growing, and historically we see growth in terms of income, but we are nowhere on the same pace that the state. So our projection assumes that even though the state is growing at 4.9%, we're going to be growing definitely a smaller, a modest percentage. That reduction that I mentioned, that the city is reducing the participation on the state portion of income tax, is equivalent to $8.3 million for the fiscal 2024 budget. For the next item that I want to bring to your attention is highway user revenue. That the allocation is increased by $23.4 million, and that's the result of the House bill that passed last year, where we now moving from 8.3% to 9.5% to the city. But it's also another component that affects the overall generation of highway user revenue at the state level, is that legislation also increased the amount of corporate income tax that goes to that allocation, and that is double helping the distribution that's going to come to us. It goes from 17.2% to 20% in fiscal 2024. Energy taxes, the numbers might not look that they add up, especially if we said that the increase in the rate will be 6.3%, and we are anticipating a 5% reduction. But we are right now, we identified an issue with the returns that were received from BG&E. So the 7.8% anticipated fiscal 2024 increase in revenue is a compounding effect of a catch-up from fiscal 2023 rates and the 6.3% that we are anticipating in the rate for fiscal 2024, net of the 5% decline in consumption that we incorporate into our model. That comes down to a $3.6 million in revenues for fiscal 2024. Interest earnings, we look at data from one of Moody's Analytics. We have received monthly information from them. They do projections for the city specifically, and we are monitoring how the treasury bonds are, which is basically what we invest in short term or cash. The anticipated return for the next 18 months, and that is what is reflecting this $25.5 million increase in revenue. We are not making drastic changes to our assumption in terms of the cash that we invest on the daily basis. I think we are looking at $1.8 billion average per year. This is a little bit lower than what we have in fiscal 2023, and the reason is we were allowed to invest the cash that we receive for ARPA money, but as we spend that average, the cash will be will reduce our base for investment. Income disparity grant is increased by $3 million. The reason is specifically related to how the formula works for the allocation. The disparity grant is just an assistance that comes from the state in order to make the average per capita income of all jurisdictions in the state roughly at the 75% of the state level. So based on the formula, we saw that while population, the city is declining and income is increasing, we are growing, but not as big. We are getting wealthier, but not as wealthier as other jurisdictions. That means that it helps us in terms of how much money we will get in disparity grant. And the very last item that we want to talk about is all others, which include other revenue sources, taxes, fees, fines that we collect. We are anticipating 3.1% decline from all other sources. One of the items that will explain this reduction will be, again, cameras, moving violations, and we also have an increase in some of the tax credit costs. And this is the last slide I have, and I'll be more than glad to answer.
Any questions?
Mr. Chair.
Councilwoman Ramos?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On that last point that you made about the increase in tax credit spending, what is that due to? Is that more projects coming online for high performance? Is it more projects coming online for brownfields? Are you anticipating inclusionary? What is that?
There is a combination. We anticipate a higher dollar value from the brownfield tax credit based on the participation of recent years. We are also incorporating a higher cost for the high performance as well. And I think we are anticipating for the enterprise zone, but the enterprise zone we have offset from the state, so the cost is not as high.
Right. Okay. And then can you explain again the $3 million that you need to put in for TIF bonds? Can you explain that a little bit again? I'm sorry, I missed it.
Sure. So what happened is TIF debt service, we have to pay for it per the agreements. And we have Port Covington coming online. And what that means that we have to start, issue bond and start paying for it. There is an increase in assessment due to the initial development of these sites, but that means that those increase in assessment will also increase, it will be designated to pay the debt service.
Right.
So overall, the city is increasing assessment. A portion of that is designated for TIF, and we have to subtract that to what the real property tax revenue is. And that's why we are anticipating $3 million reduction.
Right,
due to
because
TIF.
the anticipated revenues from the TIF, because we're not getting any revenues from the TIF, we float the bonds on, but then we're still paying for the debt service out of our general fund.
Correct.
Basically.
We appropriate for it. Yeah.
So that you're saying that the Port Covington bonds are coming online, and so that's the increase in the TIF.
On the cost, yes.
Do you anticipate that? Obviously we're anticipating that growing substantially, correct?
Yes.
But the $3 million is just for 2024.
This is only the increase for 2024. Yeah.
I'm sure you've already done the analysis of what you're anticipating in the next 4 or 5 years?
We can put it together.
Can we have that? That would be great.
So what was the request again?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's to, Mr. Aponte was saying that there's, the TIF bond payments that we're making are about $3 million a year this year in addition to what we're already paying now, and I'm asking for the projection in the next 5 years. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions? Council President?
Thank you. When we talk about the excess revenue, I just want to make sure all that we went over, that's factored into the upcoming budget, right? That's the projections that we utilize to come up with the budget.
Yes.
Make sure else you're right.
Sure.
And when we talk about those, the assumptions don't carry through March. They stop at, I guess, the beginning of the year for us to come up with the budget.
I would say February, March, we could do something drastic. We are aware of something that we need to really adjust this. Yes.
So you do keep your eyes on it, but if it's nothing that's like drastic, we kind of just keep it locked in from the original assumptions that we have.
Yes, remember, yes, you are absolutely correct. Remember that we are already presenting a budget, so we cannot make this moving target.
Understood. That's so we lock in unless there's like some anomaly or something that we're projecting that is going to completely skew the numbers. Then that's when maybe we would take a deeper dive to see if we should kind of change the approach.
That's correct. The only item, as I mentioned before, that we have to incorporate is any result from the General Assembly that we don't know in February. We have to wait until April, until the session ends, and then if there's something that, we need to incorporate that, we do it.
Got it. Now, when we talk about the assumptions, is it built in our budget that the assumption that all vacancies will be filled in that fiscal year?
No, what we incorporate in the assumption is that somebody's paying taxes for those properties.
No, a vacant, I'm sorry.
It's an
vacant
expenditure
positions
question.
From the agency.
Oh, vacancy, I'm sorry.
So, yeah. So say if we have 100 vacancies, basically, it's our assumption in the budget that all those 100 positions that are baked into it will be filled that year. That's our assumption, right?
So, yes, so we identify the filled positions, we project the cost of those positions for the upcoming fiscal year. And then in some cases in agencies where there's higher numbers of turnover that they anticipate, they may assume some level of savings in their budget to realize the natural savings that we would get just from having positions vacant for any portion of the fiscal year. But it's not, we don't assume the same number across all of the agency budgets. It's based off of, again, those areas where we see more turnover in positions.
What if it's not turnover? What if it's just, say, vacant positions that's been there for over a year or 2 years?
Mm-hmm.
Like, the assumption is based off of the budget, we still factor that into their budget.
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things that we are experiencing now, especially as we have a high number of vacancies, is working with agencies to understand why we have why we have the higher number of vacancies and what is sort of the issue that is standing in the way of getting the position filled. So in some cases, you may have a lot of vacancies, but the agency may be using a contract for some reason to fill that position. You may also have an agency where there's a lot of vacancies, but it's a situation where they're hiring as fast as they're losing people. That type of thing. I think one of the things that we, especially going into fiscal 25, that we're going to have to work with agencies more is to really identify what's happening with those stale positions and figure out how we sort of update the budget to align with how they're spending funding. What we've seen in fiscal 23 is that some of the agencies that have had high number of vacancies for an extended period of time, they've really looked to identify how they could utilize the vacancies to help with pay. So like, for example, you see in rec and parks where they said, we've got a lot of vacant positions in rec centers. Part of the reason why we have a lot of vacant positions in rec centers is because of our pay. So we're going to reduce the number of positions that we have, and we're going to pay people more. And so I think we're seeing agencies do more and more of that, and I think we'll continue to see some of that as a way to get creative in terms of being able to do more on the compensation side.
Yeah, I guess the assumption is that plan should be baked into the fiscal year 24 budget, though, right?
That's right. We try to work, agencies do the very best that they can to reflect their staffing plans in what they are requesting for the budget. And so we see there's sort of, in 24, you'll sort of see, the catch up of things that happened post the adoption of the 23 budget. And then you'll also see where they've sort of laid plans for what they are intending to do in fiscal 24 as well.
Got it. When we talk about the supplemental, and you guys probably can't answer this right now, but when we talk about the supplementals that came before the council this year, wondering how much cost savings did we get from vacant positions? Is there a way for you to determine that?
We can go back and look at our fiscal 22 actuals, and I can give you that exact number. Again, really one of the big drivers of why we had the big surplus in fiscal 22 was because of the transfer and recordation taxes, which was really just attributed to the real estate market getting much, much hotter than what we would have anticipated. I think on that point too, with the revenue, as Pedro was mentioning with some of our assumptions, the other thing that we really try to understand in looking at the revenue is where is this a dependable, reliable, ongoing increase in revenue versus where is this a one-time blip? Where they're, transfer and recordation, it's the perfect storm of low interest rates, high demand, that sort of thing. Because what we want to do is we want to make sure that if the revenue, if a major change in revenue is one time, we don't want to bake that into the overall city budget because all we're doing is creating a gap down the road.
Got it. I guess just back to the personnel. So when, say there's an agency A, they have 50 vacant positions. If they move the money, if they get approval from finance to move the money inside of the agency, that wouldn't necessarily come via a supplemental to the council, right?
So the ordinance of estimates establishes appropriation at the service level, or at the agency and service level. And so under the charter, if agency A wants to move money from administration to IT, and those are two different services in their budget, that would require BOE approval in order to do that amendment. But let's say they want to move money from office supplies to travel within their administration budget. That is something that, under the charter rules, that can be approved administratively without having to go, to BOE or for council. Where you will see the supplementals that require council approval is if we are transferring funds across the agency or if we are changing the bottom line of an agency budget.
So just to make sure I understand what you're saying, the council will easily be able to determine the amount of supplemental money that was created by vacant positions, because that, if it was transferred outside of administration, which is basically personnel, it would have to come through the council through a supplemental, right?
Yeah, if it's crossing the agency. But if it's crossing services within the same agency, that requires BOE approval, but does not require council approval.
Got you. And it's easy for us to like factor in how much money that was in 23, is that right?
So we can give you a summary and synopsis of what all of the year-end actions that happened for fiscal 22. Fiscal 23 will come before the body to do those supplementals after the year-end data is complete. A lot of the year-end processing that takes place, through most of the summer. So I would anticipate we'd be back to you with our year-end rundown and legislative actions in the fall.
And just the last question, we don't utilize that data to come up with our projections to ultimately bake into the projected budget?
We do. I mean, we do. We work where we see that we have, high number of vacancies with agencies. We try to understand, why do we have this high number of vacancies? What's the impact of operations? And then, it's our goal to make sure that if they're using savings in their budget to offset other types of expenditures, that we would update the budget to best reflect the plan of how they're going to spend the money. I think with positions, there's just a lot of sensitivity in agencies about giving up a position and then, not being able to get it back. But I do think that that's something, especially coming out of the 24 budget, we're just going to have to dig into deeper with agencies and really figure out what is realistic and how do we make sure, like I said, that the budget reflects the plan of how you're actually going to spend the money.
Yeah, I mean, and the reality is, this is not a Baltimore City issue. This is a global issue as it relates to workforce, and we understand that. I don't think anybody's really going down the path of maybe abolishing positions. However, I think when we talk about staffing plans, there could be options of freezing positions and identifying the money that's tied to the positions that are frozen, particularly positions that have been vacant for quite some time. So I guess that's where my question is going. As we go through approving this budget, what will be the council's purview be in the future as it relates to some of the money that's tied into positions that, obviously, my colleague right here asked about, we've gone back and forth and asked several questions to BBMR about, so just trying to, better understand moving forward how that looks and feels, because I think it's really complicated and a huge challenge, not only for the agencies, but also for you from a financial perspective to project out, as it relates to retention and hiring for these vacant positions.
For sure.
Is that it, Mr. President?
Yes, thank you.
I think you had a request. Am I clear? Did you have a request?
Well, we already had the request in about the vacancy, so I think we're good there.
Any other questions? If not, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
We'll reconvene in this LO 21-0178 until the next budget hearing. Briefing, I'm sorry.